Mr. Speaker, the member who has just resumed his seat, the brains trust of the National Caucus, has encapsulated the problem with this bill. If this was the National Party moving quicker, it took them 2.5 years to even think what their policy was, sir, because all they were elected with was a slogan which said, and I call it to mind, $1.5 billion subsidy buys fibre to the home for 75% of New Zealanders within 10 years. Here's the problem. There's the card. The problem was the numbers never did add up. There was never any way that $1.5 billion of a commercial investment seeking a rate of return could have achieved that. And when the Minister, Stephen Joyce, realised that he'd made an undeliverable promise, he went through all sorts of contortions to try to make ends meet. The net result of that was essentially to sell the law for a subsidy which no other than Sir Roger Douglas pinned officials to admit was worth between $400 and $600 million per annum worth of disguised subsidy. Now, the point about selling the law is it's become a habit for this government. Whether it's Warner Brothers or Sky City or Telecom or CanWest, the issue here, sir, is that this Parliament is being dragged into disrepute by a government that has deserted principle and has no clue about policy design. I won't go further about Mr Bennett's speech because, to be honest, sir, and I try to be fair, he made no contribution to the Select Committee process at all, and he's made no contribution of substance to this debate. Mrs Turia, however, did, and I want to pick up on a couple of points which she has made. The first is that the Māori Party was late to the play in supposedly forcing a concession from the government on the issue of the regulatory holiday, the bizarre prospect of 10 years with no oversight by the Commerce Commission. And I agree with the position the Māori Party finally took. But they voted with the government at every stage of this bill in Select Committee, and they made no oral contribution to the debate at all. And what I suspect, Mr Speaker, is that the Minister himself, rather like his perhaps involvement in the Epsom selection for ACT, realised that he'd got the entire industry offside, that everybody other than Telecom was siding against the government, and he was isolated in a minority of one. And I can imagine the conversation where he said to the Māori Party, hey, come up to my room, why don't you pretend to force concessions out of me so that I can get out of this dead-end street that I've got the government into. So I would suggest that the government, that the public, think very, very carefully before they accept the Māori Party's protestation that they got this over the line. The government knew it was in trouble. Nobody at all in the industry other than Telecom supported them. Now, not even the Te Hurihika Trust, who were the owners of shares in 2 Degrees Mobile, 2 Degrees and Bill Osborne in particular, argued vociferously against this bill. They made clear it was bankrupt in terms of policy design. Why did the Māori Party not take a stand earlier in the Select Committee process? Only the rearview mirror and the voters will tell. And I note that they're coming a dismal third in the Titai Tokoro by-election because they are becoming irrelevant to the national debate. They have become the playthings of the National Party, and that is a sad thing to see for a party that once held the mantle of some people's aspiration to have fallen so far so fast. Behind the Speaker is Sir Roger Douglas, and I want to offer a sincere compliment to Sir Roger. His questions in the Select Committee were incisive, and his minority report, at least the first 4 parts of it, are of a very high standard, and I would reference them for the public's reading. Unfortunately, his alternatives were almost worse than the problem, which were just leave it to the free market. And it's here, sir, that I have to do a brief trip down memory lane. Before we busted, the Labour government busted the telecom monopoly, we had Telecom taking monopoly rents off New Zealanders. We had low investment, high prices, and one of the world's slowest broadband. When we busted that market wide open, we got double the investment flows. New Zealand climbed up the broadband rankings, and we had a better competitive environment where all, including 2 Degrees Mobile, could play. So more market means more monopoly, Sir Roger. That's the problem we came from. Well, let's look and see what this bill does. The slogan, as I said, was $1.5 billion buys fibre to the home for 75% of New Zealanders. Never could, never would. Not when that wasn't a straight subsidy. That was a commercial investment through Crown Fibre Holdings with a rate of return, big strings attached. And the minister realised when he got in office that it wasn't a policy at all, it was a slogan. Now, Labor had broadband, ultra-fast broadband packages up and down the country ready to go. I know because I was the minister. I had them signed off sitting on his desk the day he took office nearly 3 years ago. And we have lost a full 2 years of rollout because that party campaigned on a slogan and that minister had no policy when he took office. So what did he decide to do after those 2.5 years? He came up with an absolute mess. An absolute dog's breakfast of a prescription. Imagine, as the Commerce Commission, I have to say this to listeners, I've never seen a Crown agency testify so strongly against the government of the day as the Commerce Commission did, and good on them, against this bill. Because the regulatory holiday would have taken them off the job for 10 years. That's about 5 generations of broadband technology. The great-great-great-grandchildren, in technology terms, would have got a look in by the Commerce Commission, but not until then. What the bill did was it replaced the old telecom wire monopoly, abridged by our pro-competitive regulation, with a new fibre monopoly. It wasn't Telecom. That name was always a furphy. It was actually Chorus, which has the monopoly on the wholesale and network layers. And if the government wanted a competitive environment, it needed a fair and open access regime. Well, we managed to twist their arm into getting equivalence of inputs, technical language I know for the public, but it means that Chorus would be forced at the wholesale level to at least tell people what the conditions of offer of sale of services would be, and that would have to be the same for internal and external parties. It just doesn't apply to fibre for the first 8 years. Doesn't apply to fibre for the first 8 years. So what we're left with is a system where the people that own the network, Chorus, Telecom 2, do not have to tell people how the detail is drawn. They do not have to offer exactly the same product on exactly the same term at the layer 0 and layer 1 level of the wholesale network. They can screw the scrum under this bill. The effectiveness of the regulation is cut to pieces, and the government knows it. And it's not an accident, Mr. Speaker. The public need to know this is a deliberate policy choice, because the government's subsidy fell short, so they had to buy the bids by selling the law. Just as they did to Warner Brothers, just as they're doing to Sky City, just as they did to CanWest on the broadcasting spectrum fees. It is a terribly dangerous, slippery slope the government is on here, where the integrity of the Crown itself is called into question not only by terribly bad policy design, but by the deliberate giving away of the public's protection in exchange for money in the hands of the bidders. It is as crass and as crude as that. And if government members of the FEC didn't appreciate the game, then they have less intelligence than we credited them for. I'd like to think they do. Sam Lodoinga and Craig Foss, I know Craig Foss is an intelligent man, and I know he must understand that these bids have been bought. And Sam Lodoinga has a so-called business background as well. If he does, let him take the next call, or Mr. Foss, and explain to us how the government has not solved the law to encourage bids in terms of bad regulation. So our key concerns were the ridiculous regulatory holiday through 5 generations, the lack of clarity around the open access regime, the mandatory averaging of prices, the opaque and tilted asset split within Chorus, the Commerce Commission exemptions, the possible breaching of our World Trade Organisation obligations, and the question of tax write-offs for telecom, which we will explore in the committee stage. This is bad law. It will leave New Zealand worse off than before, and the next chapter of this debate is a monopoly on content for Sky TV, and we'll come to that later.
Mr. Speaker.